Morning. My name is Tracey Farrigan. I'm an economic geographer with the U.S. Department of Agriculture Economic Research Service. Today I'll be presenting information on agriculture and rural communities, providing an overview of current state and key climate vulnerabilities. The content for this presentation is drawn from the 4th National Climate Assessment, Volume 2, Impacts, Risks, and Adaptation in the United States. The National Climate Assessment is a United States government interagency ongoing effort on climate change science conducted under the auspices of the Global Change Research Act of 1990. The NCA is a major product of the U.S. Global Change Research Program, which coordinates a team of experts and receives input from a federal advisory committee. NCA research is integrated and summarized in the mandatory ongoing National Climate Assessment reports. The reports are extensively reviewed by the public and experts, including federal agencies and a panel of the National Academy of Sciences. The most recent, the 4th NCA, was released in 2 volumes, in October 2017 and in November 2018. This presentation stems from the 2nd volume, and more specifically, Chapter 10 on Agriculture and Rural Communities. U.S. farmers and ranchers are among the most productive in the world. The agricultural sector makes an important contribution to the U.S. economy, from promoting food and energy security to providing jobs in rural communities across the country. Contributions through GDP and employment are shown in figures A and B in detail. In 2015, U.S. farms contributed about $137 billion to the economy, accounting for about 0.76% of gross domestic product and 2.6 million jobs. About half of the farm revenue comes from livestock production. Other agriculture and food-related value-added sectors contributed an additional 4.7% of GDP and accounted for 21 million full and part-time jobs. U.S. agriculture enjoys a trade surplus in which the value of agricultural exports, both bulk and high-value products, accounts for more than 20% of total U.S. agricultural production. Top high-value exports include feedstocks, livestock products, horticulture products, and oilseeds and oilseed products, and these exports help support rural communities across the nation. U.S. agricultural production relies heavily on the nation's land, water, and other natural resources. In 2012, about 40%, or 915 million acres of U.S. land was farmland, of which 45.4% was permanent pasture, 42.6% was cropland, and 8.4% was woodland. Only about 6% of the farmland was irrigated. Agricultural land use can change over time, and these changes are sometimes reversible, such as when shifting between cropland and pasture land, and sometimes irreversible, such as when agricultural land is converted to urban uses. These natural resource bases are affected continually by agricultural production practices and climate change. The current state of agricultural systems in different regions of the United States is the result of continuous efforts made by farmers, ranchers, researchers, and extension specialists to identify opportunities, practices, and strategies that are viable in different climates. However, any change in the climate poses a major challenge to agriculture through a number of avenues, including increased rates of crop failure, reduced livestock productivity, and altered rates of pressure from pests, weeds, and diseases. Rural communities where economies are more tightly interconnected with agriculture than with other sectors are particularly vulnerable to the agricultural volatility related to climate. A major portion of rural communities in the United States depend on agriculture and other related industries as economic drivers. As of 2013, about 46 million people, or 15% of the U.S. population, lived in rural counties, covering 72% of the nation's land area. And a total of 444 counties were classified as farming dependent, shown here on this map, of which 391 or 88% were rural counties. Many residents of rural communities maintain a connection to traditional livelihoods, relying on the natural resources found in the region, which are inherently vulnerable to climate and disaster impacts. Rural economic sectors, such as agriculture and forestry, have already been impacted by climate change due to extreme temperatures and drought, and this trend is projected to continue, further impacting human health and labor productivity. While adaptation and mitigation measures can moderate climate change impacts, rural areas generally face additional limitations, such as poverty and limited access to health care, which will make coping to climate-related challenges more difficult. Contributing to these challenges are historical legacies, largely related to natural resource bases, that continue to impact rural economic well-being, such as slavery and Jim Crow in the Mississippi Delta and Black Belt, colonization and subjugation of indigenous populations, such as on Native American lands, resource curse and internal colonialism in Appalachia, the borderlands and colonials of the Southwest, economic restructuring and deindustrialization in the upper Midwest, and immigration and diversification across multiple areas in the nation. Overall, the NCA found that climate changes projected by global climate models are consistent with the observed climate changes of concern to agriculture. Climate change has the potential to adversely impact agricultural productivity at local, regional, and continental scales. Crop and livestock production in certain regions will be adversely impacted both by direct effects of climate change, such as increasing trends in daytime and nighttime temperatures, changes in rainfall patterns, and more frequent climate extremes, flooding and drought, and consequent secondary effects such as increased weed, pest, and disease pressures, reduced crop and forage production and quality, and damage to infrastructure. While climate change impacts on future agricultural production in specific regions of the United States remain uncertain, the ability of producers to adapt to climate change through planting decisions, farming practices, and use of technology can reduce its negative impact on production. Risks associated with climate change depend on the rate and severity of the changes and the ability of producers to adapt to changes. The severity of financial risk also depends on changes in food prices as well as local to global trade levels, as production and consumption patterns will likely be altered due to climate change. Many countries are already experiencing rapid price increases for basic food commodities, mainly due to production losses associated with more frequent weather extremes and unpredictable weather events. The United States is a major exporter of agricultural commodities, and a disruption in its agricultural production will affect the agricultural sector on a global scale. Food security, which is already a challenge across the globe, is likely to become an even greater challenge as climate change impacts agriculture. Food security will be further challenged by projected population growth and potential changes in diets as the world seeks to feed a projected 9.8 billion people by 2050. Specific to agriculture and rural communities, the NCA found 4 key messages. Key message 1, reduced agricultural productivity. Food and forage production will decline in regions experiencing increased frequency and duration of drought. Shifting precipitation patterns, when associated with high temperatures, will intensify wildfires that reduce forage on rangeland, accelerate the depletion of water supplies for irrigation, and expand the distribution and incidence of pests and diseases for crops and livestock. Modern breeding approaches and the use of novel genes from crop wild relatives are being employed to develop higher yielding, stress-tolerant crops. The second key message has to do with degradation of soil and water resources. The degradation of critical soil and water resources will expand as extreme precipitation events increase across our agricultural landscape. Sustainable crop production is threatened by excessive runoff, leaching, and flooding, which results in soil erosion, degraded water quality in lakes and streams, and damage to rural community infrastructure. Management practices to restore soil structure and the hydrologic function of landscapes are essential for improving resilience to these challenges. The third key message has to do with health challenges to rural populations and livestock. Challenges to human and livestock health are growing due to the increased frequency and intensity of high temperature extremes. Extreme heat conditions contribute to heat exhaustion, heat stroke, and heat attacks in humans. Heat stress in livestock results in large economic losses for producers. Expanded health services in rural areas, heat-tolerant livestock, and improved design of confined animal housing are all important advances to minimize these challenges. The fourth and final key message is vulnerability and adaptive capacity of rural communities. Residents in rural communities often have limited capacity to respond to climate change impacts due to poverty and limitations in community resources. Communication, transportation, water, and sanitary infrastructure are vulnerable to disruption from climate stressors. Achieving social resilience to these challenges would require increases in local capacity to make adaptive improvements in shared community resources. To find out more about these messages and about the topics discussed in general, you can read the full chapter on the website provided here. Thank you.